Okay, so nice to meet you, everyone, and thank you so much for having us. My name is Yung-Hsuan, and here with me is our colleague Nitya. We're affiliated with Equiano Institute, so our collaborators are in the back, Joanna, Jonas, and Chinasa. And for this symposium, we presented a conceptual framework for how we can examine AI life cycles and all the processes with ethnographic methods. So the focus will be on human practices, so on and so forth. But to reproduce the entire paper with a lot of detail, that's quite a lot. So I don't want to do it today. I want to start us off with an actual ethnographic case that I did a few years back. And it focused on an organization that developed an AI system. And I want to focus on how exactly this organization actually came up with the problem that the AI system is supposed to solve, and then all the different actors and practices, interactions involved in between. As any ethnography goes, you need to have a backdrop, a site. So the site today is an NGO, a non-governmental organization. The name is Diplo Foundation. I would like to advertise for them because they're great. What they do is they try to train diplomats on digital policy issues. As you may know, diplomats have to cover a wide range of different policies. They can't pay attention to all the different portfolios with the same level of attention. So what the NGO does is that they have in-house policy researchers to follow global policy talks, and you have in-house reporters to attend all sorts of international conferences to document, what's happening in digital policy making, what are people talking about, and finally, the NGO synthesize all the findings into reports and training materials for diplomats. Now, the director, Jay, sorry, this is all fake names, and obviously he doesn't look like that. The director envisioned, there's so much information going on in this environment. How could a diplomat ever understand anything? Can we create an automated knowledge management system that processes so much of information and extract knowledge from it? But the director himself is not an actual techie. He doesn't know how to do the automated knowledge management system. What he did was he went to Igor. Now, I'll give you a little background on Igor. Igor is a trained economist. He's actually not a machine learning engineer himself, but because when he was doing his study, he did a lot of financial data analysis, statistical modeling. So he was the lab manager of the data and AI lab at the NGO. And the NGO also hired 2 other AI master's graduates, one focused on knowledge graphs and one focused on deep learning models. All of this is information that will be very important later, but I'll point it out. Another key fact about Igor is that although he worked in this NGO that focused on diplomacy and digital policymaking, actually the Igor lives really far away from New York and Geneva, where such discussions happen. When the director asked him, can you create an automated knowledge system that's based on diplomatic knowledges? He's like, how do I do this? I don't know. I don't know any of the conversation that's going on or the main topics. But large language model just came out. There's prompt engineering techniques. There's retrieval augmented generation that allows humans to interact with a large corpus of text in a very easy manner. He's like, what about we do an AI reporter? So if you recall, the NGO does send human reporters to all the international conferences to very, very assiduously note down all the conversations. What if we have an AI that does this by gathering data generated from these conferences and extracts important messages? Notice how the problem definition of what this system is supposed to resolve has changed. Now, Igor still doesn't know what exactly happens at these international conferences. He's been to them, but he never paid attention. What could he do? He talked to Mariana. Mariana is the lead reporter that has been attending all these international conferences on behalf of the organization for a decade. She knows exactly what can ever happen in this very complicated agenda. So she told Igor, okay, international conferences that talks about digital policy making usually have panelist discussions. In panelist discussions, you will have a chair that guides the conversation among few experts. Now, the problem definition changed again. This AI system is supposed to transcribe and focus on panelist discussions, try to extract information. What is good information, though? Igor still doesn't know, so he actually brought in a linguist expert that tells him a panelist discussion contains question-answer pairs. What is a good answer, though? He talked to a debater that told him a good answer should contain a clear argument and supporting facts. All of these people that talked to him informed him of what an international conference is and what can you ever learn about it. And that's what changed the problem definition to this final thing. Identify question-answer pairs, extract arguments and supporting facts from panelist responses. That was the prompt engineering that he did. And this was one of the reports that's generated from each session. You have a speaker, you have the arguments that the speaker used and different supporting facts. You have a knowledge graph, which was made by the AI master's graduate. I said that was important. That tried to link between these different speakers and different arguments. But that's still not enough. As you have seen from the agenda, there are 100 sessions happening in parallel. What can we ever learn about a massive international conference altogether? And because Mariana has a lot of experiences, he asked Mariana, if you have like a sort of like stupid reporting assistant that doesn't know much, but you want him to give you some information, what do you want him to give you? She said, I want him to tell me all the things that was said this year that wasn't said in the previous years. And that gave us the final problem definition. And this is the final work coming from the AI systems from each international conferences. If you go on Diplo Foundation's reporting page, you will find that they have been covering all international conferences in this way through prompt engineering and a lot of fine-tuning. But what I wanted to point out here is that from the simple problem definition all the way to the very contextualized, operationalized, you have so many people working together. And this points to the fact that that AI developer is not working in a vacuum and alone. He actually socially interacts with people, and you have all these people coming from different backgrounds informing him what anything is. And in our paper, what we're trying to do is simply to formalize it a little bit in the grand AI lifecycle system, which of course is way more complex than this. What can we ever learn about it if we take a ethnographic approach? Now hand it over to Nitya.
Sorry, I haven't been as good and memorized my slides like Yung-Hsuan did, so just bear with me while I hold my laptop. So as Yung-Hsuan mentioned, that there are very many different kinds of people involved in this process, and during different parts of the AI life cycle, there are different actors, different processes, different values that sort of impact and influence the AI life cycle. But many of these behaviors and attitudes and interactions are sort of obscured from actual data practices and hidden because of technical processes of actually creating these labs when they're more sort of social than socio-technical, but we're unable to see those because a lot of the way AI labs are built are using technical processes. So AI systems that are created on developers' context may not capture the sort of tangible, more socio-technical systems. So our paper sort of proposes to embed an ethnographer through these different kinds of mega processes. So you can highlight the practices, local knowledge, various social interactions, and relationships between these different actors to talk about the different values that stakeholders bring in sort of these practices, to bring out more of the social technical aspect, moving away just from a technical analysis of how these are built. So this is sort of our call to action in the paper. We argue that current AI labs are focused on technical processes and audits which do not adequately capture social technical implications of AI systems. We say that ethnographers would be able to carry out this research not only as temporary external observers, but as active participants who understand these very different practices, are able to highlight why these practices take place and what impacts they actually have in the AI design, development, and deployment processes. So 3 minutes or 5 minutes is not enough for us to give you an entire overview of what our paper is. So we invite you to read our paper and sort of let us know what you think, share feedback, share suggestions. And I also wanted to shout out that Yung-Hsuan and I were collaborating with Joanna, Jonas, and Chanasa, who I think are here in the room. So this was like a joint effort. So thank you, everyone, and we'd love to engage a bit more. And this is the QR code. So we do that. Yes.
Thank you so much. I think maybe we should 4 questions at the end. Elizabeth and Duncan. Is this Duncan? Yes.
Yes.
If you advance this slide, then it should. Great. Thank you.
Do you mind if I touch my laptop here in case I need to look at some notes? But thank you so much. Hi everyone, I'm Nitya. I'm a PhD student from Queen Mary University of London, and I'm going to be talking about how we can use arts-based methods in participatory research. So this is a project that we were interested in, how we can involve people with lived experience in the development of AI in healthcare. So as you've heard a lot, there's been this big call to democratize the development of AI through participatory research. And this is really involving the public in the development of AI. And I am a data scientist. I'm not a participatory researcher or a social scientist, much to my misfortune,
But I'm very interested in what this actually means in practice. How can we really involve people who have very different levels of experience, of knowledge, of lived experience, of educational levels, who speak different languages? How can we involve them in the development of AI? Can this democratize AI? What does that look like? And who should we be involving in the development of AI? And so we know in healthcare that AI can really worsen health inequalities in minoritized and disadvantaged groups. But these are often not the people involved in AI research. There are lots of different reasons to this, but one of the ones I looked at was that actually existing history research methods can often reinforce these barriers to participation. So often methods revolve around being able to read and write kind of in English predominantly in the country that I work in. There's often requirements to have access to the internet. You might need to have some digital literacy. And so I was very interested in what other methods can we be looking at so where we can reduce some of these barriers. I would also just add, because I had to check my notes there, that AI can also add to these barriers. There's an impression that AI requires technical or sort of numerical literacy, and people are often kind of more reluctant to get involved in AI research because of that. And also, we don't really have a good idea at the moment in the UK anyway of kind of what AI literacy is or what it should look like. And there are very few resources out there to engage with a very wide variety of people around kind of AI research, particularly at all stages of the development phase in AI. Oh, it's this one. So this is a project that's based in an academic research study called AI Multiply. Some of you might have heard about it from a different talk and also from a poster. And it is a project looking at how we can bring together the expertise of patients, clinicians, and researchers to improve. I'm going to actually check this because this is a very important to get it right. It's the collective expertise of patients, clinicians, researchers, and artificial intelligence to improve the care of people who live with many health conditions and medicines. And that is the aim of that project. That was the objective that was co-designed with a public group of patients. And in the beginning of the project, we wanted to identify what research priorities were actually important to people with lived experience of multiple long-term conditions and taking multiple medications. So in order to make AI research a bit more accessible, we looked at using arts-based methods. And so in the research, these have kind of been highlighted to be quite playful and fun. They can make academic research more interesting. And they can also provide a platform for learning about complex concepts like AI. And there's also kind of emerging research that has also helped to show that using art and creating art can help reveal the underlying and often hidden systems of AI. Just to kind of put it into context, this research took place in Tower Hamlets, which is where Queen Mary University of London is based. We had 22 different contributors, and this reflected a very broad diversity of the community. So people aged 30 to over 80, lots of different ethnic groups. We worked with 6 people who didn't speak English, so we worked with a translator. This kind of very broadly representative of Tower Hamlets that has the biggest Muslim and Bangladeshi population in the UK. About 1 in 3 individuals attending a GP surgery are living with multiple long-term health conditions, and there's extremely high levels of health inequalities. So what this actually looked like in practice, we ran 6 workshops where we explored the use of different arts-based methods. We also used things like photographing. On the left, you can see collage that we did. On the right, you can also see ceramics. So a lot of these were very tactile, hands-on materials. But I'm going to focus in on one particular workshop where we used an AI visual image device called DALL-E. And so I'm just going to focus on that due to time. You might be familiar with this tool. It's a text-to-image AI tool. So you can type in a text or a prompt. You can see here that one of the contributors has written, "Draw a healthy pancreas in colour." And this is the image that has been generated. And you can see here some of our contributors using the system. So contributors were encouraged to kind of play around with the tool, to explore different text terms around health and wellness and medication. And they were either able to do it themselves or they could talk to a researcher who would help input the text for them. So across all of the workshops, so we used lots of different arts-based methods, although I've just kind of given you an example of one. This helped us develop different research priorities for the project that reflected the actual lived experience of the local community. And this really helped us shape some of our algorithm building practices. So for example, in my work that I went on to do, I looked at building an AI tool that could identify people at risk of developing early onset type 2 diabetes, which is a condition that was particularly of importance to this community that I was working with. Just zooming in on the AI image generator. So particularly we were interested in kind of how using AI might help us. And so AI generated art pieces could really help visualize and communicate health conditions where people struggled to verbalize what they're experiencing. So here you can see a painting of a tingling feeling in the finger with lightning symbols showing the tingling. So these actually kind of acted as an aid to make people it's much easier to talk about and express the things that they're experiencing. I would also just say it helped to make AI a bit more tangible. So obviously people had never heard of AI before. This was their first time interacting with an AI system. So actually having hands-on experience with something helped. And it also provided a platform to highlight some of the limitations and issues with these systems. So things like bias. You can see here a person's typed in a diabetic and tau hamlets in the style of Sharabuddin. The images here do not reflect the style of Sharabuddin, who's a very prominent Bengali artist. And this is something that was quite useful for us to then talk about things like bias and issues with the data input into a model, which clearly doesn't reflect different cultures. And I'll also just briefly say that there are lots of challenges. This was not perfect. It really just focuses on the beginning of the AI development pipeline. This kind of participatory work is very expensive. It required funding for translators, time, material, researchers. There are lots of technical challenges as well. So with the AI image generator tool, this required people to use a laptop, which some people weren't comfortable doing. There were a lot of lack of resources to actually talk about AI with people who had very different experiences and different levels of literacy. And then there was also, some probably wider problems that we can talk about with using an AI tool like DALL-E. And I just want to thank all of my collaborators and particularly all the contributors from Tower Heights.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll welcome Kris, Maximilian, and Karen. And I'll remind our speakers that I think this is the microphone and our Zoom guests would love to project in this direction. Thanks everybody for being here. Take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Who was in the plenary session where Meta talked about our community forums? Most people? Okay. So I'm going to provide a very, very quick overview of our team and how this project, what we are calling our community alignment pilot, maps and it compares or is contrasted against the community forums. I'm going to move really quickly so that we get to the really the meat of the conversation, some of the early findings of our pilot, which is midway. Then we're going to hand it over to Maximilian, who serves as an expert advisory member for an external body that we have an advisory group. But I'm very happy to address any questions after. Please come find me during the networking time. I know that there were a lot of questions that we didn't get to in the previous session and maybe not today at the session as well. But I'm going to move pretty quickly. I think we can go to the next slide. Just at a very high level for everyone's awareness of our team and our team's existence, we're the governance organization within Meta. We were conceived in 2018 with the mission of creating new structures to empower user recourse over the company's decisions. So creating either participatory or accountability institutions that allow users to have a greater say in either the decisions we're making or in how we're developing our products. And so it's really the latter section of that mission that we're going to be focusing on today, both in our community forums and our community alignment pilot. We have been working over the past several years to develop first an institution called the Oversight Board, which is an institution that has binding authority over Meta's decisions around content moderation, and then the community forums, which you heard about earlier today, and now this novel community alignment pilot. You can go to the next slide. So this is our journey in community governance. As I mentioned, the purpose of our team is to empower outside voices and to explore through kind of rich discussions with communities like this, different participatory methods to bring, to create rigorous processes to engage the public and bring their input into the company. So earlier today, you heard about our community forums. This is a deliberative method that you heard. We partner with Stanford University and their Deliberative Democracy Lab to assess and reconcile and engage the public on really tough innovation questions and in where there's a lot of competing trade-offs and where the company needs to make decisions with input on the with input from the public. And so it's designed to govern our products. Again, it's deliberative, so it has a lot of these features that things like citizens assemblies have, where you provide education, access to experts, and people actually work together in synchronous small group dialogues to deliberate on to deliberate on different competing tensions. And the goal is to develop different policies as well as foundational approaches to our products. Our community alignment pilot, which we're going to get to in a moment, is not deliberative, but it's designed to provide more direct input into our LLM development at the company. And so taken together, any of our community governance initiatives are really intended to engage representative samples of the public to empower user voice. That's the principle behind it, but indeed to actually make our products or our policies better at the company. We'll go to the next slide. So this is getting into that second project that I mentioned, the community alignment pilot. And I think all of us have heard a lot of discussion today about how LLMs, AI products and services are inherently insufficient in the way that they're developed because they're not inclusive of all communities across the world. And so we've been talking about the importance of participatory product development. The community alignment pilot is one new step forward that we're really excited about bringing public input into engaging representative samples of the public, bringing that into the product development in a very direct way, and developing data sets that hopefully will create more relevant and helpful LLMs for developers to use. So a very, very high level process that I will talk through, and then I'll hand it over to Karen to talk through some of the initial findings. But given the fact that LLMs are inherently Western because of the data that they're trained on, as well as the people that are developing them, which are largely American companies, we recognize that as LLMs are moving to be adopted in other markets across the world, they need to be more culturally relevant and helpful. And so this project at its core is aimed at engaging representative samples of the public to understand different kind of cultural dimensions and understand how different cultures across different markets, but indeed even within the same market, might what their expectations may be for engaging in LLM. So Karen's going to talk a little bit more about how we think about culture, but is it possible for a company like Meta to engage the public, understand deeper elements of culture and how people want to engage and what their expectations are with LLMs? And can we actually produce preference data sets to fine-tune LLMs or other outputs that would essentially make the LLM more helpful in different markets that are not inherently Western? Anything you want to add about the concept or the flow of the work, the overall method?
Maybe I'll just add quickly that the advisory group, which, and I should just clarify my role with this project, so I'm Maximilian. I'm primarily at the Oxford Internet Institute, but I'm also one of 5 experts who are kind of consulted on the project. And that happens in stages over the course of this project. I can talk about it more if there's time in the Q&A, but just wanted to add that as another step that happens.
Great. And so just to clarify, we're right here in the pilot. So right now, to date, what we have done is we've engaged representative samples of the public through collective alignment technology, Remesh, if you all are familiar with Remesh. And we are moving into a phase where we're actually going to attempt to collect preference data sets that we can then use to compare whether or not our existing Llama model performs better or comparably to data sets that are fine-tuned using this type of preference data.
All right. Well, thanks very much. And thanks very much to all of you for coming and this opportunity to share our research. The way we have operationalized culture or values is through a framework of expectations. So the question that we ask is, what are the expectations that people in different countries are bringing to their interactions with Gen AI chatbot? And how can we think about standing up that allows us to be systematic in the way that we think about a value? And so our research for this pursued in 2 stages. The first stage we used, as Kris mentioned, we used Remesh, which many of you are probably familiar with in this work. This is a really interesting tool that allows both the evaluation of, you can see there's kind of a little screenshot there. It allows the evaluation of different response sets, but it also allows and invites participants in this kind of, they call it a discussion, so we had everybody, more than 1,000 folks kind of participating in this discussion. They can all contribute their own response to a prompt, and then the participants in the discussion And so we had this opportunity to kind of get lots of perspectives on like how people will think about what expectations we would bring to a particular. So that's the first thing we did. I will say two quick limitations. So of course, these folks were recruited from panel participants, and so we take the evidence from this as something close to like SPL qualitative research or directional, as opposed to representative of the countries they're from. And then the other thing is that this is a relatively limited set of prompts, right? So that we were, I think all told there were 14 prompts included in this in the first phase of the study. And so, as I say, directional, it provided us some evidence that people do in fact vary systematically in the expectations that they bring to different prompts, and that they also and that those expectations vary across use. And so what we do next will be very focused on use case. And so the second phase, I'll just say quickly, and to give some time to start some of the findings. The second phase, essentially what we did was we, in the context of survey, large scale survey researches, we put a prompt and a set of 4 responses in front of our survey respondents and asked them to evaluate the 20 prompts. And what this allowed us to do was it allowed us to track over a large set of from a benchmark evaluation data set. It allowed us to help prioritize where do we see the biggest gaps in expectations, and where, as you might imagine, right, there includes a limited number of dancers from that function, right? And so it allowed us to prioritize across these spaces. And so on the next slide, just really high level, what we learned, kind of a few key things that I hope will be interesting to the folks here. So not surprisingly, right, the population that kind of chose the default LAMA response most often was the US-based population, but actually it wasn't all the time, and there was a lot of fragmentation within the US sample. And then the second thing is that, as I suggested with the math example, actually there's a lot of global agreement, or at least within the countries that we studied here, there was a lot of agreement on which was the best answer to questions about, for example, how-to questions, summarization, and then productivity and organization. We didn't feel like that there. And then finally, where we saw kind of the most divergence were in things like reading, for there are kind of lots of the norms of cultural communication vary quite a lot, and in recommendations. And so those are the kind of the key things that we're taking into space. So first I'll talk.
Just to, and then I'll hand this over to Maximilian, who's going to offer some open questions that I think would be really helpful for this group to give feedback on. So just really quickly in terms of next steps, as I mentioned, we're moving into this phase where we're taking the research that Karen has executed, and we're actually going to collect reference data sets from these markets, 5 different markets. And we hope what we'll do is we'll evaluate. So we'll ask people in these markets, you will provide them responses to certain prompts from our standard LAMA model, which is inherently, as I mentioned, Western, and compare that to the responses provided to the same prompts for these models fine-tuned with the preference data sets, and see if they actually think it's better. Is that a more relevant, or does it meet their expectations better? And if it does, our hope is that we would be able to open source these data sets, provide them to developers, and they will be able to use them as in their own use cases, whether that's in a nonprofit or corporate setting, company setting. And go ahead, Maximilian.
Yeah, so I mean, we're at the time limitations right now, so I think what I'd like to do is make more of a call to action you to please come approach us. Again, I'm at the Oxford Internet Institute, so I could, we can be more honest about experiences perhaps, and would love more input into this process. So what I've written here are just some questions and provocations to kind of get everyone thinking about this, because it is a pilot. And I think that, there's safety considerations. And the reason I agreed to be on this advisory group is because I think there's a lot of things that can go wrong. I also think the status quo is not good in terms of LLMs replicating kind of hegemonic perspectives. So would love to hear your thoughts and ideas, and we can talk more about these with Remainer's workshop.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Great. I'd like to welcome Bajla to the next slide. Thank you.
I feel like the previous presentation kind of really set the groundwork for the motivation of ours.
So thank you.
wow.
This work was done in collaboration with Joanna, who leads the algorithm alignment lab at MIT, who is not here. But this is about a process for deriving community-driven axes for language model alignment. So again, the motivation is that present day language model evaluations as well as alignment is inherently dependent on very specific curated data sets. And so what goes into these data sets determines our ability to evaluate along specific preferences or specific values. The problem with this is that we, as Matt mentioned earlier, that these models and data sets are developed in very specific regions by developers that hold very specific values and preferences, and these don't map to global preferences or other deployment contexts. So how can we actually derive community relevant axes for language model alignment? So what we propose as part of this research project is a process to gather community preferences and derive a set of axes along which language models should even first be evaluated or aligned. So to kind of contextualize this process in the alignment chain, this process comes before we even go about collecting data sets. It's a process of gathering community participants to even first identify for a specific deployment context, what does that community even care about? What are the axes they care about? What are the values they care about? And then we can go ahead and collect the data set.
Okay, I'll quickly take us through the methodology. We have 4 specific steps in the CALMA methodology. First is the participants get to familiarize themselves not just with our application, but also why is it that CALMA is relevant to the alignment value chain, and then they actually interact with the model in the deployment context. And then they get to go through their interactions and identify values salient in them, and finally come together as a group, whichever how we define that group, and identify what are the most valuable axes for that group for the deployment context. Just to go into it in a little more detail, when we're familiarizing the participants, we're trying to empower them to actually have a voice in this process, not necessarily just check a box. Besides familiarizing themselves with LLMs, AI, and with where in the alignment chain, the other thing that we wanted to do was not just give them a set of values to pick from, but actually take them through the grounded theory process, which lets them come up with the hypotheses themselves instead of us laying out for them. And then in the interact session, all they do is develop the data set that they are going to then evaluate and that they're going to then label by talking to the LLM on a specific deployment context that Kroner will get into in evaluation. And then in the reflection stage, it's two distinct steps. They first identify different labels or like salient values in these different interactions in the initial coding process. And then in the focus coding one, they're able to further refine it because their vocabulary sort of improves as they get more familiar with the process. And finally, through the group discussion, they get to present to the group 3 attributes, 3 values that they find most important from their data set. And then the entire group sort of sees the entire embedded space of everyone's labels of the values that everybody's individually came up with, and they're able to speak to each other, speak through the different perspectives of why they think something should be valuable, and come up with a ranking for the entire group.
Okay, so now to actually evaluate the process, we hosted 2 case studies. And we kind of wanted to compare the fact that different deployment contexts would have different values being elicited from them. So what we had was one case study of groups or students from MIT and one case study which was individuals from India. And what we had them go through both of the processes. And what we wanted to make sure was at first we wanted a neutral and very context dependent use case. So what we went for was an educational assistant designed for high school students to supplement their education in history. So we chose a topic that can be very value laden in its own specific contextual way, but at the end of the day, it's still something that's like globally applicable. We then tasked our participants to identify values and qualities. We wanted them to capture the subjectivity that the LLMs were eliciting or exhibiting in a very non-prescriptive and dialogical process. And all of this was at their own discretion of how exactly they wanted to interact with the LLM, what kind of data they wanted to create. And finally, we wanted to make sure that while they were going through this, we were educating and familiarizing the users as well. So we had we provided them with videos, presentations to firstly contextualize the LLMs, contextualize the alignment chain, introduce them to grammar theory, as well as the process of the experiment that they were going through. we'll skip through these for now. Okay. And after going through this with both of the two case studies, what we found was three major takeaways. First, capturing nuance necessitates a non-prescriptive process. So the fact that we had an open-ended interaction session with the LLMs that every individual was allowed to interact with, that gave us a very rich embedding space of not just data and interactions that they had to label, but also labels that emerge. And the complexity of this entire embedded embedding space, mirrored the subjectivity of such a value association task. The second is that dialogue accommodates the subjectivity of these non-prescriptive processes. The fact that we had a group discussion allowed for participants to talk through their specific experiences and come to a final ranking of their definitions of what values they care about, as well as examples to kind of support their definitions. And finally, relates to this as well, is that community-specific definitions and grounded examples enrich the identified axis. So we didn't want them to just come about with a ranked list of values along which we wanted them to that they cared about for the specific context, but we also wanted them to grab that in a definition. What exactly do they mean by that? As well as support examples from their real interactions, which kind of supports why that value matters, how that emerged, and what they mean exactly by that. And so what this does is if this is then handed down to any developer or researcher who's then developing a model out of this, it takes away some of the subjectivity that values inherently hold.
In order to have some sort of calibration, we had an initial baseline set of prompts specific to individual groups. This one was for the MIT group that talks about the origins of the Thanksgiving celebrations. You can see just from the types of labels that we are seeing, someone found it fairly factual, but someone else found it to be quite racially biased. This is the common problem of value alignment, which is where along this bias, helpfulness, toxicity axes do we want to align the language model? But we know, but we're all familiar with that problem. The next one was that why are we picking certain axes? Why toxicity? Why helpfulness, etc. Through our focus coding exercise, we were able to see that the same axis of bias, what it looked like for the MIT participants was something as simple as, is it a colonial bias? Is it a helpful or unhelpful one? Whereas for the Indian participants, they cared about whether it was a Western-centric perspective, whether it was colonial, and also whether it was favoring a certain religious group, etc. So there was a lot of nuance that are emerging in the kind of axes that they cared about as well. And finally, with as Prajna was mentioning about dialogue, not all of these axes were necessarily me-see. So the dialogue really helped them sort of talk through the gravity or the weight of each of these labels that they were coming up with, and also talk through their perspectives. For instance, because it was a history chatbot, factual and citation were a very common label that we came up with. And we saw that they were able to sort of dissect it into actually sources of power and schools of thought and give it a richer meaning, a richer definition, and associate it with other interactions for the model to be later trained on.
So kind of just to bring it all up, there were a lot more learnings from this, but these are kind of the important ones that we highlighted today. But the goal of this was to then, we now have these axes, we have these definitions, we have these examples. This can now allow us to even build that data set. The first step to kind of going forward and evaluating or aligning the model to a specific deployment context. We can then go get participants, create that data set, get their labels, etc. And then we can bring the aligned steer language models and facilitate the rest of the process.
That was fantastic. All of these presentations were so fantastic, and we have until 45 to talk about it. So I have a few requests. Please introduce yourself when you ask a question. We're supposed to be meeting each other, and if possible, please direct your questions to as many speakers as you can. There's a lot of overlap between these talks, so you can open up your questions. And I'd like to ask all the speakers to come back. Just stand here. I think that's fine. And to remember that the mic is here. Our Zoom monitor will take questions from online, but does anyone have a burning question? Okay, please go ahead.
I have a question that will hopefully displace all the papers in conversation with each other. And I'm just curious, so I'm Lindsay Pratt. I'm a director of research at a UX research consultancy now, but I'm an ethnographer formerly of academia, but now working in industry. So for the ethnographic group, thank you so much. I'm curious how you see, and then in relation to the meta folks too, like how you see that model working in one of the big AI labs. And for the meta folks, how you see that model being feasible, if at all, for you, and what kind of productive discussion that could happen, as well as the MIT team too. Like, would that be a project that you could see teaming up with one of the big tech companies like Meta? And what would some of the trade-offs and necessary points of discussion need to be to make those models work together in a way that was productive for everyone?
So yes, thank you so much for bringing that up. And of course, on our side, we're always really happy to work with any big tech companies. That's like where the money goes, when you can observe the most data, obviously. But so how we're seeing this is that in the paper we presented this problem of clash or context. You do have these very leading AI labs developing models, and they will want to probably deploy that for the entire globe, and then you will have many use cases, different countries, different contexts. What an ethnographer can do is probably, if you work within the AI lab, you can be deployed in one of these use cases and in one of these countries and try to understand how does this model affect the people that are using them and how do people use them in the first place. Such feedback can be directly fed back into the AI development processes because it's going to be an iteration. With each iteration, you can design it better and better and capture the values and practices on the ground. So that would be one way to do it. I do think that externally, jump in whenever you want to. But I do think that, like, as an external ethnographer, you tend not to be able to actually capture that much information with the developmental practices. And ethnography as a method is very interesting in that everyone is sort of a participant in this case. The developers themselves, like, they're not exempt from this examination, but it's not like we're scrutinizing them or like tell them not to do this, not to do that. But everyone is put in this reflective position that you're actually participating in the process. And I think that's a little bit of a power dynamic reversal right there.
Yeah, maybe I just wanted to add, thank you so much for your question. That's kind of what we were deliberating about as well. And I don't know if any of you attended the previous session in the room next door, but there was a question about when do you actually embed sort of these auditing models, right? And many of them have actually happened in deployment when you start realizing things go wrong. But our paper kind of argues that it needs to be part of the process right from the beginning, from design, development, and deployment, because you can't just have ethnographers come at the end and be like, oh, this is what we should have done. This is what we should be thinking about. But as an ethnographer, you're always bringing sort of reflexivity. You're kind of thinking about these things. You're also very aware of your own positionality within these kind of processes. And we think that's quite important, especially from the design and development phase, because as Yung-Hsuan mentioned, and as the Meta team mentioned as well, many of these things are happening in very specific contexts with specific kinds of people and then being deployed to different countries like India, Africa, all over the world. And then those values are inherently embedded within the people who create them, the models that are being built, and then how they're being used. And that's kind of when you start thinking about these sort of friction points, and then you just label them as, oh, those are just edge cases. But that's not actually true. Like, that's the majority of the world. And like saying the majority of the world is an edge case, I think is quite problematic. So I think if you're kind of reflective of that from the design process, you may have less edge cases in the deployment phase. So, and that's a role that we think our paper proposes that an ethnographer within these labs can actually be a part of.
And for the Meta team, like, do you have people working in this capacity internally? Do you hire vendors to do this kind of work? And how far upstream in the pipeline? I mean, whatever you can say and have knowledge of.
Yeah, and your original question was kind of, how would this be put to use? What are the risks? How can these things all be brought together? Type of thing? Yeah, so I think, and my colleague should chime in, but you know, I mean, our hope is, right, Meta has this approach towards open sourcing our model. So if we have open source things like kind of enhanced safety measures and other types of data sets that can be used to fine tune on top of Llama. And so I think in an ideal world, the sky's really the limit. If this method works, I think we will learn a lot of things that don't work and try to improve on that. I think growth mindset and constant innovation are really important. But could you create a repository of data sets that essentially allow for much more accessible and much more globally relevant LLMs? And what we have is a kind of a rich ecosystem of developers that are starting to use Llama. And so is that a potential outcome if it works? I think there's a lot of risks that we probably don't realize. And that's why we have people like Maximilian that are on our external advisory groups to flag that, as well as the experts inside the company. Some things that have been flagged to us are like what are risks around cultural flattening? Are we indexing around the majority in a certain market? And are we going to inadvertently silence some minority voices? So there's a number of different risks that I think we want to be like really honest and open about when we evaluate that. And then the third is like this ecosystem, right? I think that it's like these types of gatherings where you learn about other methods that are underway. And what I would love to see is like, how do these methods all feed into one another? I think like a great example would be if people are running these types of methods and we identify risks, but actually we see a lot of value in it as well. You can send it to a more deliberative method to advise companies on, these are the trade-offs. Like we have value here, we have risk here. How should we be striking that balance? So we do have people inside the company that are resourced to be doing this. I don't know about not but we have people that are, you might actually know. So why don't you answer that part?
I certainly do. I'm a quant, but I would say what I was going to say in response is like I would love to be able to do this like from the ground up exercise that you all did, and the challenge is how to do it at scale in a way that yields reliable business, right? And so I think using tools like Rematch, right, and some of these other things as they get better at like kind of getting close to that like from the ground up, I think it's all going to be for the better, and we'll get closer to the ideal, which is like the deliberative input where there's like kind of the full, where you can complete the full cycle within a community of participants, right? Which is, I think, but this is a pilot, so it's also, I'm excited to see what the other things are.
The process is it right now, and it is more structured, as I think you can point out. And I think the CALMA approach is really unique in that it does allow those kinds of discussions. My heart is with deliberation. So in this case, asynchronous conversation is not the same. The participants are able to write an alternative to one of the statements that are presented. But I'd be really curious to hear what are some other ways that we can do that. But the benefit of this, of course, is that there was 1,000 participants stage one, and then like 15,000 in stage two. So it is you have to take that into account as well. But yeah, I want to hear that.
Can I say something from very quickly? I agree with you. I think it's great to have ethnographers on board, but like experts still have their own biases. I think the evolution will have to be central, and organizations like this, which have the money, will have to sort of be front and center of this work. And we cannot dismiss participatory work all the time with the age-old issue of scale. That cannot be the reason. I feel like we can get there. We will be able to refine CALMA or whichever process to be able to scale up better. And we have a lot of learnings from how we should do this differently and how we should scale this. But participatory approaches might still have to be front and center of this work, because I think when we're going to an expert level, all of these disciplines still have their own QMUL underpinnings, and we're not escaping that really.
And I do think there's a way to kind of blend more quantitative methods with more participatory methods to kind of facilitate the scale of what just happens. And we did kind of iterate through different ways in which we even want to structure the process. Obviously, funding is a huge requirement to be able to do the participatory process. And I would love to try to do this at a much larger scale, like 1,000, 2,000 participants. But I do think that there's ways to kind of break down groups, break down themes, like there to still have an evidence of that, and then still have a round up, and then maybe you have at the end you make a compromise and have a whole set of expert.
This may be like a small clarification. So in the Rematch study, we did have kind of a set of kind of what we were referring to as like closed-ended responses, but we also had a set of open-ended responses where people propose their statements, not a conversation. But then after we did go through and a coding exercise to identify the things.
Thanks, team. Let's see how many more questions we can get in. Who feels confident that their question is broadly? Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Broadly.
Broadly framed so as to include multiple.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Actually, sorry, he caught my eye. So let's take 2 questions this time, and then let's do like that. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm Jonas from the Equiano Institute, which is the first presenters here. The name is based after a Nigerian slave who was also an abolitionist. So the project is really about abolishing some of the studies about AI in Africa and in the global south. But the question that I have is that we are going into this synthetic society where we will have agents at scale. and some of the tools that are deliberative and democratic, such as Rematch and Collis and more of them, they particularly, we call them democratic, but if we were to really consider them democratic, then we should consider the inputs that we put into the systems democratic, meaning protecting preferences that people put into such systems. So to all the speakers who mentioned about scaling preferences, I think there's a question about protecting preferences at scale as well. So I think I'll be curious about, especially for Meta as they mentioned they're going to release them as open source. What are some interventions or some ways to think about protecting those democratic inputs?
That's terrific. Thank you. And we'll just take one more. Yeah, at the same time.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so just thinking about a couple of things that were brought up. So really interesting. And forgive me if I can miss or I don't frame this correctly, but my understanding of how you were describing that the coding of good speech, effective speech, in AI forums, talking about AI for good and so on, was or web forums or something, was somebody who'd put together a really articulate, strong argument backed up by evidence. And I mean, often at these kind of big forums, what we don't see is people for whom English isn't necessarily their first language, or who can't get a visa to get into the country, and who may not speak in the way that if you have, have the education that probably a lot of us here have had the privilege to get access to. So just kind of a thought on that is like, can that be therefore exclusionary, or we're coding things as good, which are missing out a whole load of other really important inputs. And thinking about Elizabeth's work, really interesting about how potentially participatory AI could also be exclusionary in the way that it's constructed, and literacy and all the rest of it. So I guess the question to you all is, how do we make sure that participatory AI does not become kind of participation washing, or we don't buy, it's a bit like AI for good, tech for good, it becomes a fact of a word without, but it still needs interrogation. What does that actually mean? And how do we make sure that our approaches don't end up being as exclusionary as as AI potential, and particularly language models that aggregate the minority view but has majority power?
Just a quick thought. I mean, one thing that I would really love to see is, right now we have this AI capabilities race, and I feel like the kind of race that I would prefer to see is, through demonstrations of processes of inclusion, because I think democracy is more of a practice than a state. I mean, we can sit and say many other things are democratic, the way that states and cities are run are democratic, but not everyone attends the town halls, right? It's usually people who have more time on their hands, or retired, or are wealthy, or from a particular neighborhood. So these things are all works in progress as far as I'm concerned. And what I'd like to see is like these initiatives kicking off the kind of competition in that dimension, so that, if Meta does, get this going in a way that is reasonably safe and better than the status quo, does that maybe spark, efforts in the same direction from other large players? And then, factoring in much more qualitative and participatory methods as we go along. So that's the thought. I hope it's related.
I would also just jump in, as I think we can do better to include a more diverse range of people. It maybe takes more effort from a researcher's perspective to kind of develop or co-produce materials that make just really research more inclusionary, but it's not impossible. I think it just takes time and money, which often isn't there, especially in academia. People want to be heard. People also have kind of the right to have their voices heard in these systems. But I don't think it's particularly easy. I don't think there's an answer for it, but I definitely think as a field we could definitely do better. I think also talking about kind of at least kind of promoting good materials and good case studies where people have been included from lots of different communities. That is also very helpful. Like when I started out, there wasn't a huge amount of literature to work from, and I didn't really know where to go to look for that. And And then obviously you kind of start your network and then you find it, but it's not like instantly that clear of where that knowledge is held.
So maybe Tim's point from this morning about that infrastructure, investment in the infrastructure, so we can all share knowledge on all of those things.
Thank you. Let's keep, who has something directly to the first question?
I can talk, but do you?
Great.
No, okay, great. I think this hopefully will also address kind of both questions in some way. I'm not a technical expert. I'm actually not an AI product engineer. I work on the governance organization, but I think everything that we do as a team, at any institution that we build, whether it's the oversight board or our community forums, I hope might address kind of a couple of the elements of some of your questions. One is anything that we build as a governance institution has to have four kind of key foundational components. One is representation. So is it representative of our user base and the people that use our products and services? So for example, with our oversight board, we have members from across the globe. And in our community forums, for example, and even indeed in the countries that we piloted on community alignment, we strive for representative samples of the public. The other one is there a repeatable and durable process? And is that process clear and consistent? So in our community forums, we use Stanford's deliberative polling model. So there's a very clear, consistent process to doing that. The second one is there sufficient, or the third one is there sufficient independence? So for the oversight board, for example, it's funded through an irrevocable trust. They have complete authority and an independent staff, and they have independence in terms of their decision making over the company. And indeed, with our community forums, as noted by Stanford earlier, Stanford is working to craft the questions with us. We provide kind of our inputs, but they are managing their platform. They are recruiting the participants. They manage the engagement with the participants, and then they publish the results. It's not us. And then fourth is really transparency. So I think it gets to the point around participation watching, which is, is there transparency around the results? And I think to the point that was made earlier during the community forums plenary, is there clarity around what we're doing with the results is really what people ultimately want to make sure we're not washing that. I think that's the continuous kind of building muscle within any institution of taking input, implementing it, and then disclosing it. So what we're going to do in the next month or so is expand a web page that actually goes through our community forums and what those impacts have been to respond to that exact feedback. So I think all of those kind of four elements, I think are hopefully the appropriate checks and balances. I think when it goes back to protecting the preferences of those people, I guess I would say, I don't know if this answers your question. I'm happy to talk afterwards, but ensuring representation and then driving down barriers to entry. So like our community forums, for example, we provide laptops or we provide cell phones to people if they don't have connectivity to participate. We provide childcare stipends, all to kind of drive up the access to the participation. So getting that preference data and trying to drive down barriers to entry. And then also the transparency element of, are you actually being transparent? So our community forums, we're releasing all the data through Stanford. And then on this community alignment pilot, we hope once it's finished, we'll be able to release data that is representative of the countries we're engaging in. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but
I guess it creates a problem. It's actually part of the problem that you are releasing those preferences. What if they are to be co-opted by an actor? How do you protect the people that you collected preferences?
So, yeah.
I think that's a very effective. So.
Yeah.
Left, which means I'd like the questions to be short. I'd like the answers to also no, I appreciate the depth. It's very important work. So we'll take two, but they should be confident. Okay, so and two. Okay.
So very quickly, considering all that being said, there's of course concerns on the limitations, and I would like to know more how you see the limitations of your own approach when we're discussing this issue of scalability, because I think in the end of the day, we're seeing this challenge that exists in the nature of participatory methods. Like even an ethnographer will never really represent what a larger group does, but at the same time, it's difficult to go one by one. And when we try to do this, like what Matt is doing, we also have this concern that there's a fine line of what's being done there and just profiling, I think I'm not saying that what you're doing is profiling, but then what's the difference of profiling? This is a question that I think it should be also always be reflected. And just to finalize that, what I think as well is that localization is interesting, but doesn't solve. I mean, sometimes I can relate with people from several other regions because like my preferences like a LGBTQ person or other kind of interaction religious, that has nothing to do with localization. So this is something to.
Thank you. Other questions?
Yes, I guess my question is, we mentioned that a lot of the issues with these models comes at the data stage. And then obviously values get embedded into these systems at every stage, but in many ways the data stage is what we're kind of often calling out as the big problem. And I'm wondering how we see the outcomes of these processes being useful to address the problems coming from the data stage. Rather than these data stages, that's in some way fundamental to the data and fine-tuning something different to fix those problems, even if we kind of address, like, I mean, this isn't an outcome one, we're not on. To what extent is any of this that we're doing kind of going to solve the problems in the lesson foundation?
Do you want to go next?
So I think one of the biggest limitations that is top of mind for me is that we're asking people to evaluate responses to prompts that mostly weren't provided, right? As opposed to soliciting, right? Because that's the only way to do things kind of in a systematic way, right? And so I think I'm positive that people would evaluate responses to their own questions in a way that's different from the way they evaluate responses to somebody else's questions. And so figuring out that to me and getting that right, and kind of incorporate it into that process, it seems to me like one of the bigger challenges.
I can also talk about the data question because I work with healthcare data and there's a lot of issues in healthcare data, the way it's collected, who's inputting the data, the healthcare practices that reflect. And I actually think you can help at least address some of those issues with just true research in this space. So as somebody who's maybe working with the data and data scientist, I might just get rid of all of the outliers that don't fit within my lovely normal distribution. But actually, if I went and took that to a tertiary research group, which we have in our project, and kind of told them about all the people which are going to drop from the data set, we can actually then have a discussion about, whether I should be dropping that data, who that data maybe then is going to miss, who am I not reflecting, could people not be attending certain appointments for certain reasons, and then going to lose this richness. So I feel like you can't exactly solve the inherent biases in the data itself, but maybe you can slightly address some of the downstream things that you're kind of doing with that data.
I think one thing to your point, scoping your built-in context, and we go more for the different context rather than the geography that you're kind of deploying in, because I do think that the use case is also motivating a lot of what people expect out of the model's behavior. And kind of to touch on the data point, I do think data is incredibly important somehow, as someone who has trained many models, it's like very important. But I do think there's layers to how we can kind of fix it. I do think that the data that you might collect for building foundation models, you're putting in a significant amount of resources, time, energy, effort, money, environmental resources. So doing that is worth collecting the right. If you are building that more specific, then further fine tune them with additional ways of including participation and tuning data stage of okay, how would we collect the axes along which we want further alignments? There are methods I think that I would love to explore on how you can try to.
You just want to comment on that, and I think documentation, like documenting where this data comes from, because I can tell you that 93% of ChatGPT-3's data comes to English. I don't know what it was for sure. So we need to make sure that you even know what is in there, whether it's representative or not, so we can get this thing.
And with that, I'd like to thank this panel.